In the spring of 1826, on a stone foundation in Hancock, Massachusetts, a Shaker elder named William Deming watched a crew of brethren and hired farmhands set the first hand-hewn oak post for a round stone barn that would shelter 52 milk cows under a single roof. I have been reading the construction notes that survived in the Hancock Shaker community ledgers, and the number that keeps coming back to me is 200. 200 winters. That barn is still standing on its original timbers, on its original stones, in 2026. Big-name builders today will tell you a wood frame in New England has a service life of 40 or 50 years. I have walked the floor of the round stone barn at Hancock. The men who cut those joints with a chisel and a wooden mallet never went to engineering school. They beat the modern average by 4 lifetimes. 2 names came back to me clean from the diaries and the town records. Asher Benjamin, a carpenter from Greenfield, Massachusetts, born in 1773, who wrote the first American architectural handbook ever printed. And William Deming, a Shaker elder at Hancock, Massachusetts, born around 1779, who built the only round stone barn ever raised by the Shakers and left behind a frame still standing 2 centuries later. A carpenter who wrote the book. A brethren who built the barn. Both of them framed in oak. Both of them pegged with white oak trunnels. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back. Here is the part that gets me. Asher Benjamin published the rules. William Deming followed them. Neither man knew the other, and neither man left a complete blueprint. The barns are the blueprint. Every surviving frame in New England is a textbook, and every joint in those frames is a sentence in a language we have almost forgotten. I have spent the last few weeks pulling names out of old farm diaries, town histories from western Massachusetts, southern Vermont, and the upper Connecticut River Valley. What I was looking for were the men who actually cut the joints, not the farmer who owned the land, not the neighbors who came on raising day to lift the bents. The framer. The one man on the job who knew geometry well enough to lay out a 30 by 40 bay barn on a level floor, scribe every mortise and every tenon with chalk and a wooden square, and trust that on raising day it would all come together without a single steel nail. Let me give you the full picture on both men, because everything that follows hangs on them. Asher Benjamin was born June 15, 1773, in Greenfield, Massachusetts. He trained as a carpenter in the Connecticut River Valley, learned his trade from a local builder, and by his early 20s he was already carving Ionic capitals for the Oliver Phelps House at Suffield, Connecticut. In 1797 he published The Country Builder's Assistant, the first American architectural handbook ever printed, and in 1806 he published The American Builder's Companion, the book that put hand-framing knowledge into the calloused hands of every rural carpenter from Maine to Ohio. Benjamin died June 26, 1845, at the age of 72. William Deming was born around 1779, joined the Shaker community at Hancock as a young man, and rose to elder. He supervised the construction of the brick dwelling at Hancock in 1830, and he is one of 2 brethren credited in surviving Shaker records with the design and supervision of the round stone barn in 1826. Deming died at Hancock on September 21, 1849, at about 70 years old. He never married. He never owned a piece of land in his own name. He left behind a barn that has outlived him by 177 years. Those are the men. Now hold them in your mind, because both of them worked in a world where if your geometry was off by a quarter inch, the whole bent slipped on raising day and men got hurt. Let me walk you through what actually happened on the ground. A New England farmer in 1780, 1820, or 1850 did not wake up one morning and decide to build a barn. The work started in November. The farmer would walk his own woodlot with an axe, looking for the right trees. He wanted white oak for the posts and the sills, because white oak is dense, rot-resistant, and will hold a peg without splitting. He wanted eastern white pine or hemlock for the long beams and the rafters, because pine is straight, light enough to lift, and easy on a chisel. He wanted beech and ash for the smaller braces. In some of the oldest barns in Vermont, in the 30 by 40 English barns built before 1830, the interior framing is almost entirely beech, cut from the pre-settlement forest on the farm itself. A typical 30 by 40 bay barn took about 60 large trees. The farmer cut them with an axe and a two-man crosscut saw, dragged them out of the woods on a sled behind an ox team, and laid them in the yard to wait for spring. While the trees were still green and soft, two men with broad axes would square the logs by eye, walking down the length of the trunk, taking off chips the size of a man's hand. That work is called hewing. A skilled axeman could hew a 40-foot pine beam to a clean 8x8 cross-section in about a day. The marks of the broad axe are still visible on every original beam in every surviving barn. Run your hand along one of those timbers and you can feel the rhythm of the man who swung the axe. The tools were not many, but every one of them mattered. The broad axe had a wide, flat blade, beveled only on one side, with a slightly offset handle so the swinger's knuckles cleared the wood. The felling axe was double-beveled, lighter, used to fell the tree and limb it before the broad axe came out. The two-man crosscut saw, sometimes called a misery whip, ran 4 to 6 feet long and required two men working in rhythm. The adze was the cleanup tool, a hoe-shaped blade used to smooth a beam after hewing or to take down a high spot on a tenon. The chisel set, ranging from a half-inch firmer chisel up to a 2-inch corner chisel, was the joint cutting kit. The slick, a long flat chisel with a handle 4 feet long, was the framer's signature tool, pushed by both hands and the shoulder to pare a tenon shoulder dead flat. The brace and bit, a hand-cranked auger with an 1.25 inch cutting head, drilled the peg holes. The framing square, the chalk line, the scratch-awl, and the carpenter's pencil completed the kit. Everything fit in one wooden tool chest the framer could carry on the back of a wagon. The wood itself was a story. In the 1780s and 1790s, when New England was still mostly pre-settlement forest, the timber was magnificent. A farmer in central Vermont in 1790 could walk out his back door and find white oak 2 feet through at the butt, with 30 feet of clear, straight grain before the first branch. By 1830, after 2 generations of cutting, the easy wood was gone. Framers had to make do with smaller trees, more knots, more grain that twisted in the upper trunk. By 1860, the white oak was getting hard to find, and barns were being framed in chestnut, pine, and whatever the woodlot would still yield. The post-1860 barns are still good barns, but the trees they were cut from were not the same trees. The 200-year frames you see standing today are almost always pre-1850, cut from old-growth wood that does not exist in the eastern forest anymore. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, I am putting them into a series of books. The men nobody wrote a book about, the ones who built this country with their hands. Volume 1 is out now. Scan the code on your screen or click the link in the description. Then come back, because what happened next is the part most people never hear. When the snow melted and the ground dried, the master framer arrived. This is where Asher Benjamin's books mattered. A village carpenter in Conway or Brattleboro or Lebanon might never meet Benjamin in person, but his copy of the American Builder's Companion sat on the shelf next to his chalk line and his framing square. Benjamin had laid out, in clear engravings, how to scarf 2 long timbers into one, how to cut a gunstock post, how to mark out a mortise so the tenon would seat without rocking. The book made it possible for a small-town carpenter to plan a frame with the sophistication of a Boston-trained builder. By 1827, the American Builder's Companion was in its 6th edition. The framer laid all the timbers out flat on a level patch of ground called the framing floor. He marked every post, every girt, every plate, every tie beam with Roman numerals scribed in chalk and then cut in with a chisel. The Roman numeral on the tenon matched the Roman numeral on the mortise. That way, on raising day, with 40 men shouting and pike poles waving, every joint went exactly where it was supposed to go. The joints themselves were cut with a chisel, a wooden mallet called a beetle or a maul, and a long-bladed tool called a slick. A mortise is a rectangular hole. A tenon is a rectangular tongue that fits in the hole. The framer chopped the mortise with the chisel, smoothed the inside walls with the slick, and trimmed the tenon to a snug sliding fit. Then he drilled 2 holes through the mortise and the tenon with a brace and bit, offset by about 1/8 of an inch. When he drove a white oak peg through those offset holes, the peg pulled the joint tight. That technique is called draw boring. Old-timers made the pegs from straight-grained, knot-free white oak, hickory, or ash. They never turned them round on a lathe. They left the facets from the draw knife so the peg would bite into the wood. A typical 30 by 40 English barn carried somewhere between 200 and 400 pegged joints, depending on how many braces and how many tie beams the framer chose. Every one of those joints was cut by hand. Every peg was driven with a mallet. Not a single screw, not a single nail in the frame itself. The joint that defined New England barn framing was called the English tying joint. It is the joint at the top of each principal post, where 4 members come together at one corner. The post rises vertical from the sill. The tie beam runs horizontal across the barn from one post to the matching post on the opposite wall. The plate runs horizontal along the length of the wall from one post to the next. The rafter foot lands on the plate just outboard of the post. The English tying joint locks all 4 of those members into a single corner using a tenon on the post that runs up through the tie beam and the plate together, with a wedged joint or a pegged joint above. It is the strongest corner joint in the Western timber framing tradition. It has been in use in England since about 1200. English settlers brought it to Massachusetts in the 1630s, and every English barn raised in New England between the 1630s and roughly 1850 uses some version of it. When you see a barn that has stood for 200 winters without sagging at the corners, that is the English tying joint doing its work. The other diagnostic feature of an old New England barn is the gunstock post. A gunstock post is wider at the top than at the bottom, flared out to give more shoulder for the tying joint to bite into. It looks like the buttstock of a flintlock rifle, which is where the name comes from. The framer hewed the flare into the post when he was squaring the timber, leaving the upper end an inch or 2 larger in cross-section than the lower end. If you see a flared post in a barn frame, you are looking at pre-1830 work. After about 1830, framers stopped flaring the post because they were running out of trees large enough to allow it. This is the part that the framer carried in his head and never wrote down. A pegged mortise and tenon joint, drawboard with white oak, will hold against the racking force of a New England nor'easter for 200 years. A steel nail will rust through in 50. The men knew this. We forgot it. When the frame was cut, the farmer set the date for the raising. He sent word to his neighbors. In rural New England in 1820, a barn raising was the single largest gathering the community would see all year. Larger than a wedding, larger than a funeral. Every able-bodied man within a day's walk was expected to come. Women cooked. Children carried water. The farmer paid for the day with food, hard cider, and the unspoken promise that when his neighbor needed a barn raised, he would be there with a pike pole in his hand. The women worked as hard as the men, and often harder. The day before the raising, they were already up before sunrise, baking. A typical New England raising day fed 40 to 60 men, 2 full meals, and an afternoon mug-up. That meant loaves of rye and corn, brown bread, pots of beans baked overnight in the brick oven, a hindquarter of beef or a roast pig from the spring slaughter, boiled potatoes, dried apples stewed into a sauce, pies of pumpkin or apple, churns of butter, wheels of cheese, and barrel after barrel of hard cider. Sarah Smith Emery, writing about her Massachusetts girlhood at the turn of the 19th century, described mothers making cheese 4 days a week from the milk of 10 cows, and women rising before dawn to peel apples by the hearth for sauce, preserves, and cider. The same hands that pressed the cheese on a normal Tuesday were pressing pies for the raising on Saturday. The cider mattered more than people remember. Hard cider was the working drink of rural New England, lighter on the head than rum, easier to make than beer, and pressed in October from the farm's own apples. A man swinging a pike pole for 8 hours on a July afternoon needed water, and water from the well was often warm and full of iron. Cider was cool from the cellar, slightly sweet, slightly sour, and it kept the men hydrated and steady. A barn raising would burn through 3 or 4 barrels of cider in a day. The downside was real. Men drank too much, swung too hard, and on more than one raising, someone lost a finger or a foot to a slipped axe. The cider barrel was a tool of the trade and a hazard at the same time. The raising itself took 1 day. Sometimes 2 if the frame was unusually large or the weather turned. The men assembled the wall sections, called bents, flat on the framing floor. A bent is 2 posts joined by a tie beam and a pair of knee braces. The crew would lift one end of the bent up onto wooden blocks, then about 40 men would take pike poles, jam the tips against the lower edge of the beam, and on the framer's call they would heave together. The bent would rise, slowly, until other men on ropes could pull it the rest of the way vertical. This is the moment when things went wrong. If the pegs in the joints were loose, the bent could collapse halfway up. If a pike pole slipped, a man could go down with a beam on top of him. If the rope snapped, the whole bent would fall back into the crowd. The records honor the men who were hurt and the men who were killed when this happened. A Wellington County, Ontario barn raising in 1885 offers a clean, documented example of what could go wrong. A girth slipped from a man's shoulder, swung back, struck the first bent, and snapped the rope holding it vertical. 2 bents fell into the crowd. More than a dozen men were injured. John Shaw, the worst hit, died a few minutes after the doctor arrived. George Sheehy's leg was almost severed. In a world before antibiotics, severe leg injuries usually meant amputation, if you wanted to live. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. The New England barn raisings of the 1780s and 1820s had the same risks. Most of the accidents go unrecorded because most of the men who got hurt walked it off, drank a pull of cider, and went back to swinging a pike pole. The ones who died were buried in the family plot and remembered in the church register. The ledger gives no name, only a number for many of these men. We honor them anyway. The wage for a master timber framer in New England in the 1820s through the 1850s was modest by any measure. A village carpenter in Massachusetts in 1820 earned about $1 a day. A master framer with his own tools, his own books, and a reputation for cutting square joints could command $1.25 or $1.50. The whole frame of a 30 by 40 barn cut and raised might run the farmer between $50 and $100 in 1830 money, plus the food and the cider for the raising day crew. Most framers were itinerant. They lived out of a tool chest on the back of a wagon, moved from farm to farm through the spring and summer, slept in the loft of last year's barn when the weather was warm, and went home in November to their own families. Their names rarely made the town histories. The farmer who hired them, paid in coin or in trade, made a brief note in the day book, and the framer rolled on to the next job. A village like Conway, Massachusetts, or Hardwick, Vermont, might see 3 or 4 framers move through it every spring. The ones who became known by name were the ones who took apprentices, or the ones who built the meeting house, or the ones who lived long enough to be remembered in print. Most just disappeared into the work itself. Once the frame was up, the work was only half done. The raising day crew went home that evening, but the farmer and the framer stayed on. The next morning they started sheathing the walls with vertical pine boards, often called barn boards, sawn at the local sawmill from the same trees the frame was cut from. The roof boards went on next, then the cedar or pine shingles. The wide door tracks, the haymow ladders, the threshing floor, the stalls and stanchions for the cows, the granary bins, the hay chute, all of that came in over the next 6 to 10 weeks of finish work, usually by the framer working alone or with the farmer's grown sons. By harvest in September, the barn was tight to the weather and ready to take in the season's hay. The frame was the bone. The boards were the skin. The bone is what is still standing today. There is one more thing to understand about New England barns that sets them apart from barns anywhere else in America. They were almost always built connected to the house. In New Hampshire, eastern Massachusetts, southern Maine, and the Connecticut River Valley, the dominant farm pattern from about 1850 onward was the connected farmstead, the layout that the historian Thomas Hubka labeled in his book Big House, Little House, Back House, Barn. The big house was the formal living quarters. The little house held the kitchen. The back house was the workshop, the woodshed, and the privy. The barn anchored the far end of the line. All four buildings shared common walls and a continuous roof. In a January nor'easter, a farmer could walk from his breakfast table to his cow stanchions without ever stepping outside. The connected farmstead was a New England response to a New England winter, and it required the barn frame to be designed and raised in coordination with the rest of the building. The framer who could cut the joints for a freestanding barn could also cut the scarf joints that tied the barn plate into the woodshed plate and the kitchen L. It was a higher class of work, and the men who could do it were sought after. I want to come back to William Deming and the round stone barn at Hancock for a minute, because it is the single most ambitious timber and stone frame ever raised in New England. In December of 1825, the Hancock Shaker dairy barn burned to the ground. The brethren lost the building, but they did not lose the herd. They put the cows under temporary shelter through the worst of the winter and started planning the replacement in January. Deming, working with brother Daniel Goodrich Jr., decided not to rebuild the conventional rectangular barn that had burned. They drew up plans for a circular barn, 90 feet in diameter at the base, with stone walls almost 2 feet thick at the foundation, and a single massive timber roof system spanning the entire interior. The reasoning was practical. In a rectangular barn, you have to back the hay wagon out the same door you brought it in. The horses do not like it. The driver risks running over a foot. In a round barn, the wagon enters one door on the upper level, drives in a circle around the central haymow, dumps the hay down into the loft, and exits the same door it came in without ever stopping. 52 milk cows stood in a ring around the haymow, all facing inward, all fed and milked without a man taking more than a few steps. The barn doubled as a feeding system, a milking system, and a hay storage system in one continuous loop. The frame for the roof was hand-hewn pine and oak, cut on Shaker land, hewn by Shaker brethren, and raised by a combined crew of brethren and hired neighbors in the summer of 1826. The stone for the walls came out of nearby quarries in Berkshire County. Every peg in the frame was white oak. Every joint was drawboard. The barn opened for use in late 1826, and except for a fire in 1864 that damaged the roof and forced a rebuild, the structure has stood on its original stone walls and its original ground sills for 200 years. The geometry of the roof is what stops people in their tracks. The interior of the barn is 90 feet across. A conventional rectangular barn would carry the roof load on a ridge beam and a pair of long plates running the length of the wall. A round barn has no straight walls and no ridge. Deming and his crew solved the problem by running radial roof timbers from a central wooden cupola down to the top of the stone wall, the way the spokes of a wagon wheel run from hub to rim. Every spoke timber was hand-hewn, every joint at the central cupola was a separate scribed cut, and every spoke had to land at the same angle on the stone wall plate, or the whole roof would have racked. The framer's geometry had to be perfect on the first try. There was no second try. Once the spokes were up and the sheathing was on, the roof was either a self-supporting wooden disc or it was a ruin. It was, and is, a self-supporting wooden disc. 200 years later, you can stand in the center of the haymow, look up, and see every hand-hewn spoke locked into place exactly where Deming's chalk marked it in the spring of 1826. Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville visited the barn in the 1850s and staged an informal foot race around its interior. They were not the only ones impressed. Agricultural reformers from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and as far west as Wisconsin came to Hancock to study the design. The round barn became a recognized type of American agricultural architecture, copied in dozens of states over the next 80 years, but the original at Hancock is the first one ever built in North America. Deming did not patent it. He did not write a book about it. He left behind the barn itself, and a brief note in the Hancock construction ledger saying, in essence, that the work was done well and to the glory of God. He died 23 years later. His grave is unmarked, because the Shakers did not mark individual graves. This is the part of the story I keep turning over in my head. Asher Benjamin lived to 72. He published 7 architectural handbooks, including 6 editions of the American Builder's Companion. His books taught a generation of rural carpenters how to lay out a frame, how to cut a roof truss, how to space the columns on a federal-style porch. When he died in 1845, his books were in every village carpenter's tool chest from Portland, Maine to Cleveland, Ohio. Without him, the standardization of American timber framing in the early 19th century does not happen. William Deming lived to about 70. He never published a book, never gave a public lecture, never traveled outside Western Massachusetts as far as the records show. When he died in 1849, the Brethren buried him in an unmarked plot, because that was the Shaker way. He left behind one round stone barn with a hand-hewn pine and oak roof frame that still functions today. Both men worked in the same period. Both men worked with the same tools. Both men trusted the same geometry, the same chisel cuts, the same drawboard pegs. One became famous for writing it down. The other became invisible for building it. And the barns that came out of that period, by the hands of men whose names we will never know, are still standing. By the most careful Vermont State Survey, completed by the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation in 2009 and updated in the years since, there are roughly 10,000 historic barns still standing in Vermont alone. Many of them are pre-1860. Many of them are still in active agricultural use. Across all 6 New England states, the total is several times that. That is the legacy. Not a monument, not a museum piece. A working frame in a working barn on a working farm, 200 winters after the first peg was driven. The thing that stays with me is the silence of it. The men who cut these joints did not write essays about their craft. They did not give speeches. They did not patent the English tying joint or the gunstock post or the drawboard peg. They simply showed up at dawn, hewed a beam, scribed a mortise, drove a peg, and went on to the next farm. The work was the testimony. The frame was the signature. Every honest barn frame in New England is a man's career, distilled into oak and pine, signed in chalk marks and chisel cuts that nobody will ever read aloud. 200 years on, those frames are still load-bearing. 200 years on, the cows still go to the same stanchions, the hay still goes up the same chute, the wide doors still slide on the same iron tracks. The man is gone. The work remains. The men who cut those joints will never be in the history books. Most of their names were never written down. The diary names the men at the raising, but not the framer who cut the joints. But the joints are still there. The pegs are still there. The hand-hewn beams with the axe marks of a man who died in 1830 are still carrying the same load they were cut to carry. I've walked the floor of the roundstone barn at Hancock. I have stood under the haymow and looked up at the radial roof timbers, every one of them hand-hewn from a single tree, every one of them locked into the next with a drawboard white oak peg. I have run my hand along the broad axe marks on a 30 by 40 English barn in southern Vermont that was raised before Vermont was a state. The wood is dry. The pegs are tight. The frame is square. There is nothing in the modern American construction industry that compares to it. Nothing in the modern American home building industry that lasts that long. We have forgotten how to make wood last 200 winters because we have forgotten the man who cut the joints with a chisel and trusted his geometry. Asher Benjamin wrote the book. William Deming built the barn. 40 men with pike poles raised the bents. The diary names the men at the raising, but not the framer who cut the joints. We honor them all. One more thing before you go. Every name I find, every number, every record, I am collecting it all into a series of books, so these men are not forgotten again. Volume 1 is available right now. Scan the code on your screen or follow the link in the description. See you in the next one.